The next speaker, Mrs. McDonald Heather, who is a professor at the University of New Brunswick, Canada, and she will give her presentation on battling adversity, women's journey back to work after a lapse due to depression.
Thank you. First, I wanted to tell you that I'm from Canada, and from the far east. As you can see, it's a huge country, and the little red dot over in the corner is the province that I come from. And I teach at a wonderful university, the University of New Brunswick, which is just nestled on the side of a hill or mountain in a very pretty city in New Brunswick. So then I get into the discussion of depression. And as we know, in many countries around the world, depression is an urgent and complex matter. It leads to much disease. And within Canada, 70% of the 1 million Canadians with depression are working. So productivity in the workplace plummets. There's more lost work days than any other medical condition, and 5 to 10 times more common than other diseases. And the other altering factor about depression in the workplace is there's usually long lapses from work. It's not something that there's a quick fix. People can be off for months or years. Depression affects women more than men at a ratio of 2 to 1, and there's some question as to whether this is related to the multiple roles they play. I'm going to skip through some of this just for the sake of time. I used a qualitative methodology of grounded theory, and I interviewed 40 women from around the province of New Brunswick within which I live. I used an interview guide with a conversational approach, and I did start with a pilot project of 10 women in order to refine my interview guide. It was a convenience and purposeful sample. What I did is I advertised the study in local newspapers around the province within which I lived, and I had women respond to me, to call me, to say they wanted to participate in the study. And I have to say that many of these women just seemed desperate to talk to somebody. They were so anxious to participate. I wanted a community sample. I didn't want to interview people from one specific workplace. I wanted to tap into the general population. So the sample included women who worked at universities, who worked in retail, hospitals, government offices. It was a wide range of participants. There ended up being 40 English-speaking women who were over the age of 19, and the ages ranged from 23 to 64, with the mean being 46.5. About half of the women were single, half married. There was one First Nation or Aboriginal woman and 5 Francophone women. The rest were English, and the interviews were all done in English. 10 were mothers. They were currently employed, but had had at least a 3-month lapse due to their depression. For data collection, I audio recorded the interviews, transcribed them, used NVivo for the data, and did line-by-line coding and continued on from there. And I have to say, this work is still in progress. It's not a completed work. So what I talked to you about today is my beginning findings. So the depression experience, and this isn't anything new, I'm sure, to people, where the women talked about being in a black hole, the overwhelming fatigue and sadness, poor memory, and inability to concentrate. They had changes in eating and personal grooming, and they had a disinterest in their normal activities of daily living. And how did depression affect them at work? Well, the women told me that they had a hard time to get out of bed to go to work, that they literally lived on their couch or their sofa. They got really behind at work. They couldn't keep up with the workload. They talked about how if they were I mean, many of them worked with computers, and how they would get so behind and inundated with emails and they couldn't respond, how they avoided social contact. And they talked about having to put on a face, and hence the picture here. They talked about wearing a mask because they didn't want people to know what they were really experiencing. So they had to put on that happy face to go to the workplace. They were overwhelmed by the work, they couldn't focus, and they had little attention span. So when they went off work, when they're off on sick time, they were relieved that they didn't have to go out of their house. They didn't have to put on this face, they could be themselves. There was no more acting. But they were worried about what people would think. And what they told me reoccurringly is that nobody contacted them from work. Nobody called to see how they were doing. Once they returned to work, they talked about needing a gradual return because of the poor memory and the lack of concentration. And the women spoke of needing to be reintegrated into the workplace. And that could be facilitated by this slow return. And they also felt that they needed social support from their peers and management, but that was not forthcoming. Now, the women returned to work when they weren't completely recovered, very often for economic reasons. And the literature talks about this as sickness presence. So they're at work, but they're really not well, and it does affect productivity. One woman said, "I'm at the end of a hallway and I don't see anyone. I only see them if I go to the photocopier. I have nothing to do and no one to talk to. It is very strange. I'm in a broken boardroom chair that I'm sitting on in a 1960s desk." Because very often their offices were moved while they were on sick leave, and when they came back, they were very often in a different place, sometimes even into different jobs. There were barriers to returning to work, including stigma and discrimination, fear of self-disclosing, and concentration and memory issues. So there was kind of a double bind here, because in one sense the women were saying, nobody comes to me to ask me how I'm doing or to inquire about my health. But at the same time, they were very reluctant to disclose. So it was a difficult situation for that reason. With the stigma, because once you're tagged with mental illness, you're a problem to the corporation. You are either going to be laid off or fired, or you are just seen as somebody that cannot handle responsibility. That's too fragile. I cannot tell you the amount of prejudice in the workplace. And another person said, one person that I told that I was off for anxiety and depression said, "Oh yeah, we're all stressed here, but we don't get to take the summer off." So very little support. There were benefits to returning to work, and obviously one of them was economics, because very often sick time ran out or sick time wasn't adequate to cover their costs of living. They also benefited from the structure and it helped with the recovery, and it also combated the social isolation. However, that didn't work well if they were plunked in an office down the hall by the photocopier where they didn't see anybody. The recurring theme that has emerged from this data is that of battling adversity. And the women speak of being in a constant battle. They battle the depression, not wanting to give in to the symptoms, and yet being immobilized by the symptoms. They battled the workplace that wanted to continue to add work to their already busy agendas, that pushed them into life in the fast lane when they weren't ready. And they also had to fight to receive accommodation in the workplace. They battled the bigger institution that had policies related to sick benefits and return to work procedures, And they had to wage battle to draw on benefits that they had paid into for years. So it wasn't always easy to go on long-term disability or whatever sick benefits they wanted to access. Very often there was a long, detailed process in order to be awarded that. Women lost their jobs or were moved to different departments where they had to start anew. And this was difficult when they weren't feeling well. And in cases where their jobs were lost, they had couriers actually delivered their personal items to their homes. So it was pretty awful. Battling adversity. One woman said, "I was told by the insurance company that I had to return to work or my benefits would be cut off. I wasn't ready, but I went back. After my 30-day progressive return, I met with HR, and they told me that my corporate values differed from theirs and that they were laying me off. Then the security guard accompanied me back to my office, and I picked up my stuff. They gave me $25,000 to shut up. I was disgusted, but too weak to fight them." Another recurring theme was the active practice of silence. And I think there's a lot of connections here between yesterday's speaker who talked about stigma. The women conceal their depression. They act, they put on that face. They very strategically disclose. But there's also a secrecy within the workplace. Employers, because of confidentiality, don't tell others why the women are off. But at the same time, co-workers don't reach out to these people because for some reason it's a taboo area to enter into. This woman said, "So I didn't tell them I had a depression. I just told them I had surgery. It's easier that way." Someone else said, "I didn't disclose. I had taken some time off, and so they knew I was taking off for sick reasons. Initially, it was just vacation days and stuff like that. And in all honesty, I wasn't getting any support." Secrecy within the workplace. Yeah, it's the silence. If I had arthritis, they would be saying, "Hey, you want to check out this book or that site?" But with depression, it's so silent. Part of my depression was a feeling of loneliness, and so I'm still feeling lonely within my work environment. I've been back now for 3 weeks. Nobody has come down to my office to see how I'm doing. And this is just the last slide. Strategies for returning to work. What are some of the things we can do to help women with this transition into the workplace? Well, first they need to be welcomed back. And they need to have a meeting with HR and with their immediate supervisor to find out what accommodations they need and that can be worked out for. Women should return to their old offices or at least someplace that's familiar. They need a slow, gradual return. And they need to have a defined workload because what many of these women told me, they were either overworked, piled on with assignments so that they couldn't cope, or for others, they weren't given any work at all. They were just put at a desk and a computer, but weren't given an assignment, and that just contributed to their existing feelings of worthlessness. The final thing is tackling stigma, which is a big one, and it's a big one for the community. It's a big one for the women because it's so debilitating. And what the step that I'm at right now is reaching out to different human resource departments of different employers to see if I can share the findings of the study so that we can step in and start creating some of these changes in policies that so affect these women. And that's the end.
Now, thank you very much. Are there any questions to Mrs. McDonald?
Yes.
Which one do you believe that has the biggest stigma in a workplace, depression or bipolar?
I think for either. I think for mental illness in general, there's incredible stigma in the workplace, and I don't think it's more or less for one or the other, but it certainly was there for these women with depression.
Any other questions?
Thank you. Henk Verhulst, I'm a psychiatrist in New Zealand.
Yes.
You studied women. Have you any sense about there being a difference if you had studied men?
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
You studied women. Did you have a sense that your outcomes would have been different if you had studied men?
Well, I don't know that they would be. I would like to do a study with men. I did that for a beginning step to address it with women, and because what the literature was saying in terms of the incidence in women. But I have a feeling many of the findings would be similar.
Yeah,
Yes.
Any further questions? If there are none, thank you very much again for your interesting presentation.